You've been away for a while.
I've been away.
I've missed you, actually.
Thank you. I've missed you too.
Yeah. I've missed hanging out and having these conversations, and your steady rudder in the congregation.
Why, thanks.
Yeah, it's good. It's good to have somebody with a steady hand. Why don't you do our land
acknowledgement? Yes,
Yeah,
indeed.
Please.
We are here in Nanaimo, in the traditional land of the Snuneymuxw people, primarily, one of the many, many, many nations of the Coast Salish Nation, which are all around the Salish Sea, which includes many parts of Washington State as well as British Columbia. And for that, we're very grateful, and we say to those people who have maintained that land and share it with us so willingly, Haisipka.
Haisipka.
Which is the plural of Haichka.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you. And I also, I've said this before, but the idea of welcoming our own ancestors
every
into this
time we
space.
do that land acknowledgement now, I have that sense of, I don't really know who my ancestors. It's protocol for the Indigenous people when you introduce yourself, to introduce yourself where you're from and what family you're from. Much of that, I think, to us white settler types is lost. We're not really in touch with that. But it's nice to have that reminder.
Yeah. And maybe perhaps if we go back far enough, we all come from the same
Absolutely,
family.
We do. We know that. Yes. We have to very, very far.
It's a long time ago, longer than I've been around.
Right.
So, recently you attended a reconciliation workshop held here in Snuneymuxw.
Yes.
And you have some ideas to share about that.
Some thoughts too. It's always not particularly. Some people find it quite emotional that when they learn things they weren't aware of. I just feel like totally exhausted for 2 or 3 days afterwards while I process some of this stuff. And really, I've already known it much times. We've done a couple of the blanket exercises here, and I've been to several workshops. But each time, if you stay open, you kind of grasp it on a bit of a deeper, more personal level.
Right.
And much of what we did was breakout groups, just small groups. Unfortunately, most of us were white people, talking about what needs to be done. And the first question is, why is it important to establish positive relationships with Aboriginal people? And some people may think it's not important. But the first thought that comes to my mind is we live in a democracy. And in a democracy, the majority rules. It's very clear that the Indigenous people are in a big minority here. So in order to get some of the legislation passed that's needed for their furtherance and their rights, they need allies. They need advocates. They need more of us to be aware enough of the issues that we bring a majority to what needs to be done. So that's one thing. The second thing is we need to have some kind of relationship with the Indigenous people, and if we don't make it a positive one, we run the risk that it's a negative one. And it's very heartening for me to notice in recent years more and more Aboriginal people being successful in the arts, being elected to politics, getting their education, their higher degrees, their masters and their doctorates, and teaching and being higher visible. And that's wonderful. So they're more and more finding their voices. There's always the possibility that those voices could get an aggressive negative edge. I mean, who would blame them? So let's have positive relationships with them in order to head off any, of course there's a lot of resentment among many Aboriginal people. It's inevitable when you know what was done. So let's just make our relationships as positive as we can, just to sort of set the stage as more and more people become aware. Yeah. Some white people, let's just use that for the minute, are a little bit afraid to give the Indigenous people too much. They're actually afraid they're going to want to take back our land. I mean, one could understand that, but that's pretty bizarre today. One of the speakers said, when you have that fear, you're actually afraid of yourself, because you are the ones who take away other people's lands. We don't do that.
Right.
So when you fear losing your lands, you're actually fearing yourself. I thought,
That's an interesting perspective.
that was,
So here's what I'll say to that, having not attended
Yep.
the workshop, but just on that is I mean, we can look at the relationship portion aside, and just what if we looked at where we all kind of agree? Like, at least I know for me, and I think for a lot of people that I've run into in our congregation and outside of our congregation, the land is pretty important. And the animals on the land are pretty important. And understanding nature and being one with nature seems like a really good idea. And that is something that they stand for.
Yes.
And so even if we look past the politics and the fear of what am I going to lose or what am I going to gain,
right,
and just look at where we actually are in alignment, and how we can support their cause to bring back that tradition of the sacred land, the sacred creatures, and respecting everything that's around us. I mean, what a beautiful way to live. And so we could adopt that ourselves, and in a lot of cases we have.
Right.
And so we're already together on something.
There's you have a difference in consciousness because of our history between the Indigenous people and white people. The Indigenous people never had a concept of land ownership. It was no more, nobody can own the land, nobody can own the air, nobody can own the water. Why would we have the idea that we could own the land and reserve it to ourselves? The land was given to us by Creator for all of us to use. And so when the settlers came in and the conquerors, we called them explorers when we went to school, really. We called them explorers. But they weren't, they were conquerors. Just like the conquistadors in Spain.
Some may have been explorers,
well,
but
yes, that too.
then the corporate enterprise came in after and went, well, how can we capitalize on all of this?
Right. And actually that began with the doctrine of discovery, which was a result of the Pope telling Christopher Columbus and all those folks that if they found a land that was not inhabited by Christians, it was terra nullius, which means vacant land.
Right.
And so the Pope gave them authority to claim all that for the British crown and the French crown and all that kind of stuff. So that was kind of... But our attitude, too, is we celebrate aggression in a way. We might call it courage, adventure, that sort of thing. We've got the Europeans had the conquistadors, the Vikings that came and, well, what did they, the Vikings were Norsemen who undertook large-scale raiding, colonizing, conquest, and trading throughout Europe and reached North America. Along the way, they raped, tortured, and murdered. And yet, in our lore, when we hear the movies and stories about the Vikings, they're kind of heroes, the conquistadors, where in the Indigenous culture, it was not so much about individuality as communal cooperation. So we come from those two kind of backgrounds that give us something we need to reconcile to start with.
Yeah. That's interesting.
It is.
And I don't even, sometimes I don't know what to say about it.
Yeah.
Like I feel, what is there to say at this point? I'm not in alignment with that thinking. That's like, period. I'm just
not. If we think about it, we're not. But, it's interesting to look at our own exposure growing up as settlers in a predominantly white society. What was our awareness? What's the background? And I grew up in metropolitan Toronto, in the suburbs. I went to day camp one time, and we were told to walk single file Indian style. That was my only education other than TV. And the movies, the Western movies we saw, cowboys and Indians. It was my assumption that the native people had all been eradicated from North America. I was probably well into my 30s or 40s before I ever met or even saw an Indigenous person. So when actually my first, I guess, really in depth thinking about it, when it was a few years ago when Hope Lutheran Church here did a blanket exercise, and then we did the blanket exercise here, and since then we made some contacts with Itsumquatan who comes and speaks to us. But to actually meet Indigenous people and know the story opens you up to something different.
Yeah.
What was your first experience?
So mine goes way back to my earliest memories. We had a relationship in our family. I referred to her, and my brothers and sisters referred to her as Grandma Smith in Ontario. So my family originated from Thunder Bay, and she lived on the island that my family lived on in Thunder Bay, and she was Indigenous. And as a young boy, I had moccasins that she had made me. I had a little birch bark canoe that she had made me, and a teepee made out of leather that she had made me. I think it was leather, hardened leather. And so I actually had, and I remember her vaguely in my mind. I know I met her, obviously, and I know I sat on her lap as a kid. And so that's my first. I've always just known of her, and she was just another person I knew. There was no, I didn't think of her as Indigenous or not Indigenous. She was just Grandma Smith in my family. But as I fast forward to being in school and moving to Tsawwassen, and there being working in a Greyhound bus station in Kamloops, and also in Fort Macleod, Alberta, where there were, what's the word? I can't think of it. The
Indigenous populations?
Yeah, but what the reservations, thank you. That was just, I couldn't get that. Yeah, there was reserves around. That's when I learned racism. That's when I learned the drunken Indian.
Yes.
That's when I learned about they were different from us. Up until then, I had no concept of it.
Yeah, and I think that's the tragedy. So many people, that's their concept.
Yeah.
And it's so justifiable when you look at all the people who are still so traumatized and affected by that and not achieving. And there's a wonderful book, Bob Joseph is the author. It's called 21 Things You Might Not Know About the Indian Act. And I'm not going to elaborate on them, but I want to read those 21 things to you. Number 1, the Indian Act denied women status. 2, introduced residential schools. 3, created reserves. 4, renamed individuals with European names. 5, restricted First Nations from leaving reserve without permission. 6, enforced enfranchisement of any First Nation admitted to university. Now, enfranchisement means you're given the vote. This was also true of anyone who served in the armed forces. They were forcibly enfranchised. That means made into Canadian citizens, and they were no longer Indian. So they lost their status under the Indian Act. Number 7, the federal government could expropriate portions of reserves for roads, railways, and other public works, as well as move an entire reserve away from a municipality if it was deemed expedient. 8, the federal government could lease out uncultivated reserve lands to non-First Nations if the new leaseholder would use it for farming or pasture. 9, forbade First Nations from forming political organizations. 10, prohibited anyone, First Nation or not First Nation, from soliciting funds for First Nation legal claims. 11, prohibited the sale...
Hold on, though. But without...
Okay.
special license
From the Superintendent General.
Like without license from a body that has a vested interest in this going a certain way, right?
And this, I'll carry on then, this 1927 amendment granted the government control over the ability of First Nations to pursue land claims. 11 prohibited the sale of alcohol to First Nations. 12 prohibited the sale of ammunition to First Nations. 13 prohibited pool hole owners from allowing First Nations entrance. 14 imposed the band council government system. 15 forbade First Nations from speaking their native language. 16 forbade First Nations from practicing their traditional religion. 17 forbade Western First Nations from appearing in any public dance, show, exhibition, stampede, or pageant wearing traditional regalia. 18 declared potlatch and other cultural ceremonies illegal. 19 denied First Nations the right to vote. 20 created permit system to control First Nations' ability to sell products from their farms. And 21 created under the British rule for the purpose of subjugating one race, Aboriginal peoples. And you wonder why people don't fit into our society. And not to, I mean, that's number 2, introduced residential schools. Well, that is a horrendous topic just in itself with all that other stuff.
Yeah, I can't even fathom the idea of somebody taking my children.
I know.
And deciding their future without. Yeah, I can't even.
And that's trauma that lasts for generations.
Yeah, it's not.
And so many of the parents losing their childs then did not know how to parent when their children came back, possibly because they took to alcohol to numb the pain, and so we throw the epithet drunken Indian, So what some of these reconciliation workshops are all about on a one-to-one basis is just raising awareness and changing attitudes and what can we do now. So that's the tough one, because in there are a lot of white people who would like to get to know the Indigenous culture more, and yet we're kind of afraid to ask and afraid to intrude because we're afraid we wouldn't be welcomed, and we could understand that.
Yeah, I don't know. For me, I don't know if it's I don't know if there's a fear there. I would expect, if I'm actually thinking about this with any kind of critical thinking and curiosity at the same time, I would expect to be met with some resistance.
Yes.
Like, how am I going to learn to trust you? Right?
Exactly.
That wouldn't surprise me. I think for me, my hesitation more is to, first of all, not knowing how to act. Like, do I just show up as me? Like, is that the best way for me to show up? Is just to be me and act the way I would normally act? I'm worried about not doing things within the regard of a protocol, right? I'm worried about, that's a concern. I don't know that I'm worried about it, but it is in my head. Like, is there a certain way I should enter or greet or not greet? Yes. Or like what am I not? What do I not know here that could lead to the wrong impression, right? Being set out. So I think, I'm not that afraid of them, of anybody on the Indigenous population thinking they might not trust me right away. I would expect that would be the case, right? Yeah. Like, if I'm any kind of reasonable human, I have to earn something back that's been taken away.
Exactly.
So that doesn't surprise me. It's more I'm not sure what to do. And then the third one is, I guess the third one is I don't want to go there thinking, I want to befriend them because it's the right thing to do. Like maybe I never have a close friend that's an Indigenous person. Like, maybe that's just the way it goes. It's not something I need to do, and I would never want to do it under the basis of like, oh, I'm trying to look good, or this will look good for me as a person to know that, hey, look I hang out with all these people.
Yeah.
Like if I'm doing that, then it's the same thing. It's untrustworthy, right? So
Right.
I think those are, at least for me, those are the questions I have rolling around in my head anytime I think of a relationship with any other race, so to speak,
Yep.
right? Like, why am I doing this? Am I doing this because and I'll bring this to my own personal experience. I have a group of men that I've shared many times. One of them was here recently,
Yes,
Dr. Suki. Yeah, Dr. Suki is, clearly not a white guy,
Yeah.
right? It never dawns on me that he's not unless I actually think about it. Otherwise, he's my brother.
Yeah.
Like I go to his home all the time. I eat with his family. I know his children. I know their birthdays. Like it, and I didn't do it because I wanted to be friends with a guy from East India, right, from the East Indian culture. I didn't do it for that reason. I did it because I like the guy.
That's right.
Plain and simple.
And all the, not feedback, but the advice I heard at this workshop over the weekend was, yes, be yourself. Be honest, be true. And there are protocols that the First Nations people go by. When you introduce yourself, you introduce who you are and what family you're from, what tribe you're from, where you were born. And we may or may not know that. It's not that important to you and me, but that's what they do. And the important thing is to listen and to respect and to not dismiss and not deny. What I was startled with, I sat next to a First Nations woman who I know, and I know somewhat of her history, and I said to you, was your story ever not believed? Did anyone ever not believe you or dismiss you? And she said, all the time. And it was the police and the medical profession that, do not dismiss that story. Do not deny it. I mean, you can't make up anything worse than what actually happened to people. So why would you doubt their story? So listen.
And that's like spiritual counseling 101 right there, is allowing someone to be heard and repeating back to them, paraphrasing back what you heard so they know that they were heard.
Yeah.
And if you didn't get it right, they'll correct you. Like, it's fascinating. Anytime I've sat with somebody and I've done that, and like, so I just want to make sure I understood what you said. You said da 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 da, and it's like, and if I'm right, they'll go, yeah, that's right, and then you move on. And if I wasn't correct, they'd actually go, no, that's not quite right. It's like this. The other person will make sure that you are clear on what they're saying if you're really trying to understand them.
Yeah.
And hear them, right? And I think that goes whether it's spiritual counseling or just being with a friend.
Yeah.
Just hanging out with a friend and you're talking to them and you're like, so you don't like so-and-so because of this? And they're like, no, it's not because of that. It's actually this thing here that they really annoyed me, whatever it is.
When you were talking about your friend, your Indian friend, Dr. Suki, I was thinking about the difference between every other minority culture, every other immigrant that comes to Canada. They have left their homeland, usually by choice, in hope of finding a better lifestyle, and willingly tend to adopt into the Canadian lifestyle.
Right.
With the Indigenous people, it's totally different.
It's the exact
They
opposite.
had no choice. We came and brought our culture to their land. So we cannot just, I hear people say, well, they lost the battle, winter takes all. That's not it.
No.
That's not it. In this place
That's
also.
a really good, I don't know. I know that I've thought of that. I don't know that I've really thought of it. Like the idea of, if I, just think of this for yourself, if you're listening to this. If you were going to move somewhere, to Indonesia, let's say, or to any Eastern culture, and they had Buddhist practices and meditation, and that was something you were seeking in your life, if you went over there, you would do everything you could to try to assimilate into the culture and become one with it and be adopted into it, right? That way you would have this sense of belonging. Whereas you're absolutely right with the Indigenous people, they weren't asking to come in. They were already here.
But it was forced assimilation, which ultimately became genocide.
Right.
Or attempted genocide.
Whereas imagine if we'd have come over and adopted ourselves into their culture, and
exactly,
what would that look like now? How different would that be now? It's hard to even imagine.
We may not have as much climate crisis as we currently have. Maybe let our imaginations go on that one. But we can. I mean, the Indigenous people are very willing to share their ways and their knowledge if we're prepared to listen. And I think we really should. And as a matter of fact, I'm trying to contact an Indigenous woman who I met a few years ago and ask her if she'll go to lunch and just talk about the possibility. Could you come up with a half a dozen Indigenous women, and I'll come up with a half a dozen white women, and could we all just maybe get together and have lunch once a month? And just start there. I know some of the churches have men's breakfast in which the men and the Indigenous men and white men breakfast together. But first of all, you have to make the contacts. You have to find some way to reach out.
Yeah, I think one of the hardest things also I find is just, again, that point of just being me. I'll give you an example. Like, I'm the kind of person, if I'm shopping at Costco and I see a couple of kids in a basket and they're doing something funny, I will engage with them in some capacity. And it's happened to me where I'm at Costco and it is an Indigenous family, and I do it. I act the same way I normally would, and then I actually leave feeling like, oh, did I do that because they're Indigenous and I just wanted to be like a nice white guy? Like, I have this sort of battle in my head about what's appropriate and what's not, because I really just want to be in a place of treating people the way I would just treat people, regardless of where I am. I know my kids are embarrassed by me a lot in public because I am that way. Like, I just get involved with what's happening around me, and some people don't like it. I get some looks sometimes, but it's like, whatever, man. That's just the way I am. Like, I enjoy life. But I do have those moments where I question myself, right? It's more like a feeling of, was that inappropriate? Like, I'm not sure, right? I don't know.
But what's better, that we embarrass ourselves?
Yeah, I'm okay with it.
Or, take the risk. It might be worth it.
Yeah. Anyhow, I'm thinking of this because it happened recently at Costco, and I'm very happy to say that the father, I don't remember what he came back with, but he came back with a really good rib, so to speak, and we just had a really good laugh about it, right? And I walked away feeling like that was a perfect engagement. That went the way it should go.
Yeah.
Just people
of course it should.
Interacting in Costco like the way I would normally do with anybody. So I enjoyed it.
Right.
But I think that's what it takes, is being brave. Maybe being brave enough to lead by example, to just be like, I'm okay with this, and I'm gonna do my best to treat you the way I would treat anybody else.
Right. Another sort of concern I have sometimes is this idea of cultural appropriation. What is it? What is it? What isn't? And the answer I got was, anything we share, you're free to use. Just don't misuse it. Now, I'm not sure what that means. I'm just not sure what that means.
Well, I tell you what I think. I think, because I think about that, and I think of Richard Wagamese, who wrote very clearly in his books that the reason that it might seem like we don't want to share it is because we were forced underground with it. Yeah. And so it does have that element of, we need to protect this because it could be taken away from us very quickly. Whereas his view was, you should welcome these, just like you would the Buddhist traditions or any other Eastern ceremony or religion or philosophy, where you would take that on. And I think misusing it would be the idea of acting like it's your own idea.
That's the thing.
Not acknowledging where it came from. When I speak of Buddhism, a Buddhist principle, I usually say, and this is from the Buddhist tradition, right? Like, it would be the same thing. honoring the place from which it comes from. And then I also think misusing it. I recently found out that a lot of the Rumi quotes we love are actually not accurate Rumi quotes. And there's this one person in particular that was very good at sort of half translating them, but then taking some and putting them together and making it a quote.
Right.
And they're actually not authentic, original Rumi quotes.
Right.
But they're very popular and they're all over the internet. And it's just the way it is. And so that would be misuse on me. If you're going to use something, use it in its...
Acknowledge
and use it in its proper context, and not start mingling it with other traditions or sayings and then combining them as if they're the same thing. That to me would be misuse.
I think art, artwork would be a big thing. I know there was a woman who was quite famous for a while she was a white woman, but she did some indigenous kind of background combined with her painting. That was not acceptable. I know a white woman who is married to an indigenous carver, and she also does some fabric work, but she does not feel that she's allowed to do an indigenous design. Her husband just does the design, and then she can make the product. So it's that kind of sensitivity, really, isn't it? When there was the orange T-shirt craze first came on, apparently some schools, you can understand, they sold orange T-shirts at a profit as a fundraiser for the school. Not okay. Buying an orange T-shirt with a First Nations design not done by an Indigenous person. Not okay.
That to me just seems like common sense. Like if you're going to do that, then donate the proceeds to the very the very statement that's being made. Send those proceeds back to where the harm was done, not make them your own, your own
opportunity.
Your own opportunity, right? That's and I think that would be bad on any front.
Yeah,
like whether it's that example or any other. It's like if you're going to jump on a cause, then make all the proceeds go to the cause. For the cause, not for your own benefit. Yeah. Seems pretty obvious, doesn't it?
Right.
On something like that.
So in summary, how can we summarize this? Take chances, reach out, be loving, be kind, listen.
Yeah, how about just be human? Just be human with one another and
give
realize,
it a good attempt. We shouldn't have to have this conversation. That's the bottom line, isn't it?
Right.
Because we teach we are all one.
Yeah, and I think what there is for me is to just always remember, why am I doing this? Like if I'm going to go interact with anybody, why am I having this interaction? What is my purpose here? What am I trying to get out of this? Or am I just interacting with people? Because I know, as I'm sure you do, and you do, when you're out for something.
Yeah.
Right? And you also know when you're just being real. And just treat it that way. If there's something to talk about, there's something to talk about. If there's not, there's not. I hate forced conversations.
Yes.
That uncomfortable...
Like we're having right now?
No. Yeah, this forced conversation. Well, we better put a show up, I guess. No. Those feelings where you're in a situation where people, you almost feel like you need to speak. Like the silence is so deafening. It's so loud. And it's really about getting just comfortable in that all the time. Just be comfortable with, nothing needs to be said.
Perhaps this is one of those times.
Yes, yeah, okay.
Be kind. Do no harm. Thank you. Hi, Sepka.
Namaste.